We're joined now by the former executive producer of Hockey Night in Canada, the co-host of the Bob McCown podcast, and going forward, John Shannon's going to join us on Tuesdays. Hello, Mr. Shannon. How are you today?
Tough to wish you a good weekend if I'm on Tuesday.
That's true.
Well, today it works after a long weekend for some, although we work yesterday too.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. You may notice a difference in my disposition. I'm usually quite cheery talking to you on a Friday because I know I have very little work after I talk to you, and now you're going to get me on a grumbly Tuesday.
Yeah, John, normally he's in such a good mood on Fridays.
Well, listen, I've worked 25 years with Bob McCown. You don't have to talk to me worried about guys with big moods. But no, actually, that's not true. Between the first 15 years of my career with Hodge, and then McLean, and then McCowan, oh my God.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Okay, well, tell stories then.
Matt's going to be in sunglasses tomorrow.
When Hodge threw the pencil, John.
No, well, I'll tell you what. First of all, Matty, it was a pen. It wasn't a pencil.
Right.
Okay. I had actually already been fired by Hockey Night in Canada. And I was in my house in Calgary and had been hired by the competitor to Hockey Night to produce all of their playoff shows. And when Hodge threw the pen, I almost thought I should start a stopwatch before the phone call would ring. He got out of Maple Leaf Gardens, walked down to the West End Harbor Castle Hotel, and it was 23 minutes when he phoned me and said, "You got a job?" And I said, "Yep, you're hired." And we hired him that night unofficially. I had to go to the bosses to get approval in the end, but we hired him that night to be the host of Global Television's Stanley Cup playoff coverage in 1987 and 88.
You think a host would get fired for throwing a pen out of frustration today? I don't think they would. I for some reason that was a bigger deal then. I don't think if somebody got frustrated that it was so. I don't think the person would get fired.
Really?
No.
Don Cherry got fired for saying "you people."
Right, but that affects a whole bunch of people. The pen affected one person, really, right? It was.
I don't know about that. I think that if you, hey, listen, I got fired by holding the network hostage the year before, so I refused to go off the air before we finished telling the story of the Flames' upset of the Oilers. I think that if you were on the air and showed a negative situation to the decisions being made, to the programmers, I think you'd have a difficult time. Now, that said, I do think, just like with our pal Grapes, I do think that the powers that be were probably trying to find a way to get rid of Hodge at that point. And this became a convenient opportunity when he showed up the network.
I'm very happy to report I don't own a pen, and I'm not throwing my laptop, so I think I'll be safe.
Hey, listen, one of the
ready, Shannon.
Yeah, but
I
one of the
what
great
you're saying, I'm gonna throw it right into the screen.
One of the great things about this world, guys, is that we don't really have bosses.
That's true. That's true.
That's true.
And for those who don't remember the story, it's because CBC cut away from a playoff overtime game.
No. It was regular season. It was regular season, and it was, I want to say, February of 1987, and there was a bit of irony involved, and I don't want to take too long, but the Philadelphia Flyers were ahead of Montreal 5-2 in the third period, 5-2. So if you're the producer in the Leaf game that runs short, you're saying, God, I can't fill 28 minutes. Let's just go to the game because it's going to end 5-3 and we're going to be fine. Well, the Flyers came back and scored 3 goals in the third period to tie it, to force the overtime. At that point, the CBC rules were we could not go past 11 o'clock Eastern time because of the national news. You know, the mandate of the CBC is to serve all Canadians, not just hockey fans. Although some people would disagree that for years and years, that's all they did was serve the hockey fans. So the problem became at 5-5, the rules were there. The rules were in place. Dave, we can't stay. You've got to take us off the air, which Dave refused. The irony of it was the guy that scored the 5th goal for the Philadelphia Flyers was a guy named Scott Mellanby. Well, Scott Mellanby's dad, Ralph, had been the executive producer until the previous year of the show for about 17 years. And so we got a great kick out of it in Calgary because we were all there for the Olympics, and we teased Ralph, even though you're not working there, the Mellanby name is still controlling things at Hockey Night in Canada.
That's great stuff.
Oh, marvelous stuff. Yes, an iconic moment. And I believe you mentioned this to us last year. What, there's 3 years left now on this
Yeah.
Rogers Hockey Night in Canada deal. And we know the early years didn't go well. Has things gotten better there at all? Like, what do you see going forward here? Are they going to make any substantial changes, or are they just running it out here for the next 3 years?
I don't think if you talk to anybody at Rogers, they think they're running it out. They've spent a lot of money. They've built a lot of infrastructure. The new studio that they unveiled last year was not cheap. They're invested in hockey. They have, and they've been invested in hockey since they got the contract. And one of the challenges is they had so much content. Learning how to manage it was the biggest challenge, and I think they have learned how to manage it. But I suspect that Ron and Kevin and Kelly and Elliot and Jen are going to be in place on Hockey Night in Canada until the contract expires. Yeah, they work hard at it. We may not all agree with it every time, but they have worked hard at it, trying to present it in such a manner that is fitting for 2023.
Do you think there's a hybrid model to what we've talked about with you before, with what's happening with the regional sports networks in the States and teams charging per game? Could Sportsnet go to a hybrid model of that, sort of their own center ice package, where you don't actually buy Sportsnet, but you buy teams games per se, access to the, like, do you think it could go that route for cable cutters? Because the cable cutter thing is not going away.
No, it's not. But I really don't think that that's in their purview. I think that's probably the league's decision.
Just on the league, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, and I think that's the big challenge, Blake, for Gary and Bill and all the guys on the business side. And trust me, they have some smart people in that office. A guy like Steve McCardle, who has been promoted in the last 5 or 6 years to really quality positions, to find a way to not reduce the rights fee in Canada and maintain a level of exposure of the game. Does that mean it's going to be Rogers by itself in 3 years? Probably not. Does it mean that Bell and TSN are going to come back in? That's a great question. How has Bell and TSN, how have they been since they lost the contract? Where are their revenues? That's a question. When you see the success of streaming with the Amazon Prime, with the NFL Thursday night game, when you see what Apple is trying to do with MLS, now we're hearing stories about them, digging in for $2 billion for F1. There's going to be multiple platforms for the national game. It's going to be carved up totally different than we could have ever imagined, even 9 years ago when this contract was done. And it's, in many ways, it might be the total antithesis of what we saw when Rogers signed the deal. They were viewed as a gatekeeper. Mm-hmm. They were going to be the clearinghouse for everything. And perhaps the one thing we've learned is maybe that's not best for the game.
Matt, I've always criticized the National Hockey League for not going the NFL model and getting everybody to pay them. And you wonder if this is finally going to be the moment where the NHL gets multiple people paying them.
Well, they do in the States, right? Like they have multiple
Yep.
entities in the States on the national side. It's just in Canada they chose to go with
one.
But
we've had, our country's different because we, without having the volume of audience that the Americans have, the only way you can really make money is if you control all the content. That's so that you can garner all the audiences. For the longest time, when the stories we talked about Hodge in 1987, there was really only one producer of content of hockey in our country, and it was under the banner of Molson Breweries. Soon after, TSN came in and did a national package. So things have changed in our country, but I think that this was the only way at a time when the league was trying to generate so much more revenue when this deal was done 9 years ago, that they were offered $5.2 billion over 12 years. $5.2 billion. You were only going to get that one place, and you were only going to, and the offer was on the table. And if the Rogers executives left the room, the offer was leaving. That was part of the deal. Here's $5.2 billion, Gary. And if we leave this room, we're taking the offer off the table. And so he took the deal.
The one thing it has done, though, John, is that it has taught Bell you can survive without having to pay these huge rights fees to cover hockey. So that's the one thing that Blake and I have, and particularly being on the inside there for a couple of years, wonder about 3 years from now and the climate, particularly with the media division at Bell, is that will they ever get licensed again to get into that sort of bidding war, given that, TSN continues on reasonably strongly
But
in the
let
9
me ask you this.
years.
That's fair. That's fair. But what do you think? In my opinion, I have an opinion. What do you think right now in our country today? Here we are, the first week of October. What is the most valuable media asset in our country?
I mean, I would just the national and regional rights deals for hockey. No,
I think it's Toronto Blue Jays.
Yeah, I was just
Really?
going to say, and I think you're going to see that over the next couple of days here, where you're going to see massive audience, because it's the one team that brings people coast to coast. Like,
Well, the
maybe you
Raptors
can
do,
still
but
argue
not at that level.
and maybe you can still argue the Leafs and the Habs do, but boy, we're very regionalized. We're well beyond the two solitudes and two hockey teams of yesteryear, John.
but there's a lot of production costs there, guys, for 162 games, right? So,
Right, but you're only doing one game rather than doing 4 or 5. I think it's the Jays, and I think if you're in the competitive market, and this is just my personal opinion, if you want to compete against the Toronto Blue Jays, you better have something compelling, at least for part of the season. CFL's done okay for TSN. CFL's been fine, but it's not Blue Jays. So what you need to do is, if you can find a way in March, April, May, and June, at least to have something that can compete on a national basis with the Blue Jays, then even if you're Bell and you're thinking you're making as much money, maybe you should be taking a step back and saying, we've got to get back into the NHL. We've got to get back on a national level and find a way to put National Hockey League playoff games, Stanley Cup playoff games on some of our platforms.
Well, and let's face it, the Rogers people have been a little bit unfortunate in that they haven't had a lot of terrific deep runs from Canadian teams in the Stanley Cup playoffs. I mean,
that's the
Montreal,
risk
the
you have,
final,
though.
the 1 year,
That's the risk you have.
No, I know. Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned the Blue Jays, John, because we've just come off doing an item. There are reports in Montreal that just because the Tampa Bay Rays are getting a new stadium, don't discount a return of Major League Baseball to that city. The potential for expansion here in the next 12 to 18 months, and Montreal still being the apple of Major League Baseball's eye. They still want to get back there. And, Blake and I used to talk about this back in the day, that would Bell do a deal to bring back the Montreal Expos, finance the stadium for the content purposes, just basically do what Rogers is doing with the Blue Jays, just with an Expos ball club. What's your sense? Would the Expos work as content? Would the Expos have any kind of national appeal if we brought them back here, say 2-3 seasons from now, as an expansion team? And
Absolutely.
Do you think Bell or other broadcasters, programmers would be interested in owning the club, not just broadcasting the games?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious thing with it is Bell. I mean, BCE, Bell's parent company's head offices in Montreal. The question becomes is at what cost in the end? I mean, I think there's enough money in Montreal to buy a franchise, but you're also going to have to build a new building. And that's another $1 billion ahead of the $2 billion it's going to take to buy the franchise. So are you prepared to go into $3 billion to buy a team for Montreal? That's going to be the big question. Here's the other thing, and I don't know the regulations within Major League Baseball, but would you need the approval of the Blue Jays to get a team in Montreal? Because after all, that is now Blue Jays television and media territory. So do you need their approval? The question then becomes is what would Rogers and Bell have to horse trade in order to get Bell to invest in the team in Montreal, and what would Rogers get back?
So, I don't know. Like, has the Constitution been changed? Has the Blue Jays territory expanded since the Expos moved to DC?
Yes.
I don't know the answer.
Yes, it has.
It has? Okay.
Yes, it has. I mean, the Jays are coast to coast to coast.
Sure.
And
And
it's,
no, and I get that from a programming perspective, but as you know, with bylaws and league constitutions, those tend to spell it out. So you're telling me that Major League Baseball has basically rewritten bylaws and
You'd think the league
constitution
would like to
and
keep the
giving
door
the
open.
Jays purview over all of Canada. Huh?
I think it's, I mean, the Jays games have been allowed to be in Quebec. And so now do you want to take that away from them? And I think if I'm, Edward Rogers or Mark Shapiro, I'm sitting in the boardroom saying, well, okay, you want to put a team there? What am I getting out of it?
Yeah.
It's very similar, guys, to when we talked about Montreal and Quebec City. Even though Jeffrey Molson says, we'd love to have the Nordiques, very well that they're going to, that's losing 20 to 25% of market share and value and viewing ratings and corporate sponsorship out of the city of Quebec City that doesn't get to Montreal.
Yeah, even the Alouettes in the past have publicly supported an expansion team in Quebec City, but of course, it's when the rubber hits the road, as you know, John.
What do you make of the involvement of Kroenke down in San Diego? Have you ever heard of San Diego as an NHL expansion possibility?
Oh, so somebody actually mentioned to me last week, because I got into this discussion. Could we envision the NHL expanding not by 2, but by 4?
Oh my God.
Boy.
Could we
I
imagine
cannot.
that?
No, the answer is I cannot, because at what point do you have way too many teams that, oh my God.
I was just going to say music to Seth Griffith's ears and every other AHL superstar.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Every one of those guys that say they're a 4A player.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're second liners all of a sudden.
And by the way, by the way, the 4 that I was told: Salt Lake City, Houston, don't laugh, Atlanta.
I know. Yeah.
And Quebec City.
Oh,
That was the list I was given.
Hmm.
That was the list I was given. So
wow. Well, I got to admit, I thought when they announced to go to Vegas and Seattle, I was like, oh boy, can the player pool sustain that? For the most part, it's been pretty good. And for the most part, John, that's because everybody can play with the puck now, right?
Yes.
Like there is no more granite block defenseman with hands to match. You've got to be able to play with the puck. You've got to be able to skate.
do not talk about John Grisdale like that.
And my hat is off to Hockey Canada and USA Hockey and all the other feeder leagues who have taught this from a young age going forward. I would like to think we don't have coaches out there of 9 and 10-year-olds with systems where it's off the glass and out for defensemen, that every kid is learning how to play with the puck and every kid is learning how to skate the puck out of trouble because the NHL needs it to sustain that many players in 32, let alone 36.
Clip this off, and when we start to hear about the NHL expansion and not 2 but 4, was on Sekeres and Price.
It'll be three conferences: the Pacific, the Central, and the Eastern Conference.
Yeah,
just watch.
Yeah, and I retain the right to take back all those comments about defensemen skating the puck out of trouble and handling the puck as we watch this Canucks season, which we will preview next week, John Shannon, when you join us on Tuesday, the eve of the Canucks home and regular season opener, and of course the first day of the NHL. Thank you.
Have a great day.
This Sekeres and Price clip brought to you by Bodog. Make a play at Canada's choice for free casino games, sports odds, and poker strategies.